Hello, is this on? Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for coming here today. My name is Stephen Ross. I'm in the economics department, and I hold the Philip E. Austin Chair of Economics and Public Policy. That's named in honor of a former president of the university who actually is in attendance today. I'm happy to have Phil Austin here today, and his sort of commitment to education over the years is one of the reasons for this talk, and one of the reasons why I've continued this lecture series. In fact, Kathy Segerson, who's in the audience, was the first holder of the Phil Austin Chair, and she started this lecture series several years ago. This is the second one I've hosted. Some of you may have been here last year when Dr. Murnane spoke about immigration policy. Again, I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the talk. As I said, I want to thank Phil Austin for being here, and also for him and the other donors to the Phil Austin Chair who provide the financial support that helps us host events like this over the year. I am required to read a series of canned remarks by the people who generously let us use Conover Auditorium. I'm supposed to say, welcome to Conover Auditorium at the Dodd Research Center. Please note that in the case of an emergency or fire, there are two exits to the auditorium. One is in the main entrance located at the rear of the auditorium, and the front emergency exit is located off the stage to your right behind the podium. Please note the nearest exit to your seat. We would like to remind you that there is no smoking allowed throughout the building, and please turn off or silence your cell phone during the program. Also, you should know there are restrooms are down the hall, way to the parking lot on the left-hand side. I guess that's so people won't knock on their office and bother them to ask where the restrooms are. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I hope we have I expect to have an exciting talk today. Today, Dick Murnane is going to be talking about income inequality in private schools. Dick is the Thompson Professor is endowed chair at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's been working on education for many decades. His primary focus over the years has been to look at the impact of education on economic outcomes and economic opportunity, and that's led to a long trajectory of work that he'll be talking about, where he's been thinking about sort of economic inequality in the U.S. and the role education system in the U.S. plays in both propagating inequality, but also in creating opportunities for individuals. And with no further ado, I will introduce Dick, and I'm looking forward to hearing the talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, particularly to give the Philip Austin lecture that honors the accomplishments of a remarkable educator. I'm going to ask you in at least to chat with a neighbor for 1 minute on at least two figures. So if you could sit next to somebody, that'd be good. Okay. So
Left and right buttons?
yes,
Not working?
we people who study technology, but I'm not the poet. So the outline of the talk is basically three things: the importance of educational opportunity, evidence on trends in inequality educational opportunities. That's really a lead-in to the new work, which is how do trends in who goes to different kinds of private schools fit into this question of equality of opportunity in the United States. So this is a piece of a larger project I've been working on for almost a decade that produced these two books. The first one on the left is 2011, one on the right is 2014, and the newer work is about the role of private schools in understanding how increases in family income inequality in the United States have impacted on educational opportunities for Americans from different backgrounds. Now, when we think about the goals for American education, you each have your own list. but I would guess that these three items would be, some version of these would be on you. First of all, we want to be sure that all children leave school with the skills they need to thrive in a changing economy. Second, a very widely held value across the political spectrum in the United States is that while a child may grow up in a low-income family, if that child works hard, the next generation, that is his or her children, will not grow up in a low-income family. And clearly, educational opportunity plays an absolutely key role in making that goal a reality. And you'll see why in a minute. And the third, which is perhaps a bit more controversial, but if we think of the challenges facing our country, I think the goal is to impact common values critical to the effective functioning of a pluralistic democracy, including cooperation, mutual respect, and appreciation of differing points of view. And I want to come back to what kind of schools does it take to make all three of those goals happen, really. So the next is a figure. This is not my work. This is David Otter's, an economist at MIT. And I'd like you to spend 1 minute talking about, with a neighbor, about what patterns you see. And I'll ask for a couple of volunteers. So 1 minute, starting now. What patterns do you see? The left is males, the right is females. Basically, what happened to the earnings of people with different education compared to what they were in 1963. So talk for 1 minute with a neighbor, if you would, about what do you see? But it also followed by a comment or two. What do you see that you find interesting in this pattern? Raise your hand, please, if you'd be willing to offer a comment. No cold calling here. Please, nice and loud.
Divergence that's more pronounced for males than females.
Very nice. Everyone hear that? Divergence more pronounced for males than females. Thank you. Nice and loud.
Except for the highest education level, women have been going more, they're doing better than men.
Right. Now, one point is this is relative to where they started, relative to where they were in 1963. So relative to where they were, that's absolutely right. But in particular, notice the contrast. Notice male high school graduates, high school dropouts. Look at where they were in the late 1970s compared to where they are now. And of course, this is to a large extent, these are manufacturing jobs that males had, relatively few women had, and because of the disappearance of those jobs for a host of reasons and a decline in the wages of those jobs in manufacturing that are left, we see high school educated males not doing nearly as well as they did in the past. One more comment, anything else that you see? Steve?
I want to know how bad things look for the people who don't get a bachelor's degree, even though they're going to college as males. I mean, it is striking how there's almost no difference between spending some years in college, possibly going to community college, and getting a high school degree.
That's a very good point. I think one thing that Steve knows so well, our information, and this comes from current population survey, which is the monthly survey administered to almost 100,000 households in the United States, from which is derived the unemployment rate each month, and they ask lots of other questions too. The questions they ask about educational attainment don't provide at all any specificity among people who get some college. If that some college is a 2-year nursing degree that allows you to be an RN, you do quite well. But it depends, an awful lot of people who go to some college don't get any credential, and that, I think, is what you see. But, okay, so thank you for, that's my kind of start on the first. I'll have more pictures for you to talk about. So, this is a statement I want to make that some of you may view as somewhat controversial, but I think the evidence supports this very much. Diverse student bodies are critical to accomplishing the goals of American education. Now, I'm going to focus on schools that are diverse in that they serve students from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, because that's what I have data on. But of course, I think it's equally true for race ethnicity. And the argument for this is, first of all, it's very, very difficult to build and most of all to sustain high-quality education in schools serving only students from low-income families. Now, you probably, a lot of you know about schools that have succeeded in doing that. And I applaud the educators who work in those schools. It's no more important work. Unfortunately, a great many of those schools, you see them, they seem remarkable. You go back 5 years later, and the leadership has changed just because the work is so hard. So, I mean, that's not that there aren't schools that are very special and do a wonderful job, but it's just so tough to sustain it. The second thing is economically segregated schools limit students' interactions with peers from different backgrounds. Very hard to learn to appreciate diverse perspectives if you don't hear from people who have come from different backgrounds, have different views. So I want to talk, so basically the kind of subtext of the talk is, it's important to pay attention to, I believe, to the degree of diversity in American schools. I think diverse schools are important in fulfilling those 3 goals of American education that I stated earlier. Now, I want to say just a couple of slides about data. How do we learn about the income of American families? Well, we ask about them in the current population survey. Individuals, there's 1 respondent per household. The kind of last question, because they're afraid they won't answer it, so they put it at the end, is basically into which of 16 bins does your family income fall? So these are these bins. The lowest bin in the 2016 current population survey is less than $5,000. The top bin is $150,000 or more. So you see which, and so basically, you know not the individual income, but you know which bin they fall into, and you can turn these individual values into estimates of what income percentile of family income falls in. And the way we organized it, basically, we have information, our key variable here is what income percentile a child family lives in. So the 10th income percentile, what it means is that 10% of the nation's elementary school age children live in families that have lower income. The 50th median income percentile means half of the nation's children live in families with lower income. And the 90th percentile means that 90% of the children live in families with lower income, and that 10% live in families with higher income. Okay? The reason we do that is so we can compare across years. So, that's the next graph I want you to talk about. So basically what we've done here is, this corresponds to the 10th percentile, the 50th, the 90th, and the 95th. So each line is a particular income percentile. What you have on the vertical axis is the family income net of inflation. So that's all at constant 2015 dollars, taking out the effect. So this is a statement about purchasing power. Okay. I'd like to spend 1 minute. What do you see there that's interesting?
Like 10th percentile means that like 10% are falling in that
Okay, we're going to have a couple of volunteers, perhaps different people. What do you see? What's interesting? Anything surprising? Thank you. Nice and loud, please. Yes.
Well, wages for people at the 10th and 50th percentile have stagnated, or for families, while wages for families in the 90th and 95th percentile have grown quite substantially.
Thank you. That's what's right. So these are annual incomes, okay? Annual incomes in dollars, and we see that basically 50% of the nation's children are growing up in families that have less than $75,000 in income in 2015. So, and second one, another comment? Anything else you see? Is it inequality grown throughout the whole, from the bottom to the top as well? Or where is inequality, where's the growth in inequality concentrated on? It's the top, isn't it? So it's between, so notice, yeah, it's growing a little bit between the 50th and the 10th, but not a whole lot. The real growth is between the 50th and the 90th, and between the 90th and the 95th. That's where the growth is. Now, keep that in mind, because what I'm going to then talk about is what happened to the enrollment in different kinds of private schools. We're talking about 90-50 gaps. 90% enrollment rate minus 50% enrollment rate. The reason is that's where the gaps have grown. Now the gaps have been growing even more between the 90th and the 95th, but for reasons that you can guess and I can mention to you, it's hard to get good information the further out into the tail you go. Okay, so we see this. This is, of course, it's not a surprise, given the earlier graph on what's happening to wages. Basically, if you've got two parents, both with a college degree, both working full-time, you're probably in the 90th percentile, which is basically earning $175,000 or a little bit less. If you're a single parent with not much education, working in even perhaps 2 minimum wage jobs, you're probably down. And a striking number of children, unfortunately, growing up in families in that situation. Now, so this is what's happened to the family income of children in different parts of the income distribution. So the question is, well, what happened to inequality in educational outcomes? Now, we saw earlier how important college graduation was, particularly four-year college graduation, as Steve pointed out. So we might look and see, well, what's happened to four-year college graduation rate for kids from relatively low-income families versus kids from relatively high-income families? And this is what you see. So these, vertically, these are kids who were teenagers, 14 years old in the mid-1970s. And if they came from a family whose income was in the bottom quarter of the family income distribution, only 5% of those kids got a 4-year college degree by the age of 25. Among kids who were in age 14 in the mid-70s who were from the top income quartile, top 25%. A little more than a third got a 4-year college degree at age 25. Now go 20 years later and look at kids who are teenagers in the mid-90s instead of the mid-70s. And you see if they're in the bottom quarter of the income distribution. It's gone up, but it sure hasn't gone up very much, from 5 to 9%. So again, when we think about intergenerational mobility, we think of opportunity to do better than parents, and how important education is to make, particularly post-secondary education, to making that happen. We see this is a very disturbing pattern. In contrast, when we look at kids from top income, top quarter income families, more than half of them are getting a 4-year college degree. So that has grown enormously. There are other measures of inequality educational outcomes we can look at as well, but this is all we have time for this today. Now, how did that happen? How is it that growth in income inequality translated into growth in inequality in educational outcomes? Well, there's a whole bunch of paths. One is how much families spend on child enrichment. The second is where families choose to live. The third is what kind of school the kids go to. And the last, which is the focus for today, and I will get to, a role of private schools. So let me just show you a little bit of evidence on each of these. What this is amount of money, net of inflation, all the 2008 dollars, that families from different parts of the income distribution spend on enrichment for their children. So what you see is in the early 70s, the difference was about $2,700. Again, all constant dollars. Look at the difference among 30 years later, it's a difference of about $7,500. Now, what is that? What does child enrichment mean? High quality child care, vacations, summer camps, SAT tutoring, unpaid internships, all of these things that are really important in getting kids prepared to succeed in college and succeeding in life. So that's a piece of the story. And that doesn't even count how much money is spent on housing. Then when you look at, well, where do families from different backgrounds live? And this is the work of Ann Owens, a very good sociologist at UCLA. Basically what you see is, so what's in the vertical axis is a measure of the extent to which a community is segregated by income. That is, all are poor families or all are relatively affluent families. And what you see here is not much change among families without children. But then you go and look at families with children, you see an enormous increase in residential segregation. So basically, this is relatively affluent families buying housing in communities with high-quality schools where the housing is too expensive for lower-income families to be able to move. Now, does neighborhood matter? Does the income of the extent to which is poverty in the neighborhood matter? Well, until about very few years ago, we really didn't have any answer to that question that was compelling. This is a question sociologists have struggled with for many, many years. But then, there's this incredible research that a group of economists, primarily, though not all economists, social scientists have conducted with so-called the Moving to Opportunity experiment. This was funded by the U.S. Department of Housing. Basically, they took a sample of low-income families in 5 different cities. Families who were eligible for housing aid, and they asked them if they wanted to participate in the experiment. And if they did coin flips. And basically, those that lost the coin flip stayed in their public housing. Those that won the coin flip were the key group was they were given a housing voucher that they could use to pay for housing, but only in a neighborhood that had a significantly lower poverty rate than where they currently live. So then they followed these families for 13 years. So the key question is, did it make any difference to the kids in these families if the family won the lottery to move to a low-income neighborhood? And the answer is yes, as long as the children were less than the age of 13 at the time the family was given the offer to move to a low-income neighborhood. This is by Shetty, Katz, and Hendren. So basically, what these are earnings at different ages of kids who were in families that won this lottery to move to a low-income neighborhood, compared to kids in families that lost the lottery. So what you see is enormous gains in income, but only if the kids were quite young when their families were given this opportunity to move to a lower income neighborhood. So neighborhood matters enormously as long as the kids are young when they move. Now the third thing is, so we've got family spending more, we've got neighborhoods mattering, and then the schools that matter. And basically, schools that serve very high concentrations of low-income kids have a very difficult time providing high-quality education for a variety of reasons, among them these bigger effects, student mobility effects, and teaching effects. Bigger effects are basically if you've got several children in class who have experienced trauma at home, in some cases trauma having grown up in Central America where there was enormous violence, and then moved to many schools in Boston like that. Those kids are so traumatized, they act out of class in ways that take enormous amount of teachers' time to deal with them, less time for instruction. That's been shown to have low effects on kids' achievement of their classmates. Student mobility effects, schools that serve kids with high concentration of poor income kids have a lot of kids moving in and out. Why? Because their families lose their housing. And there's very good work showing that it's detrimental effects on kids' learning. And finally, the work is so tough. It's very hard to keep high quality teachers in those schools. So that's so far. Now, then the last question is, what about private schools? Do they play a role in, particularly, do they play a role in either ameliorating the extent to which schools are segregated by income, or do they play a role in exacerbating that? So that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. So I'd like you to spend 1 minute again talking about your view of the answers to these two questions. So I'd like you to have a number for the top one, and then an up, down, or stay the same for the second one. And maybe what other questions that raises. Talk about that for a minute. Elementary school children attend private school. What percentage? No dollars attached to the outcomes here. So, what do you think?
1%.
1%. Okay, thank you. Well, it's only 1%, we can all go home, it doesn't really matter. Any others? Yes, sir.
15%.
15%. One more? The back.
5%.
5%. Okay, so we've got a range. How about, has it gone up or has it gone down? How many think it's gone up? Okay. And a few, any downs? The red are secondary school students, the blue are high school students. One thing you see is that a larger percentage of elementary school students go to private school than high school students, and that's true throughout the last half century, but the gap between those has declined. And we see really there was a big drop between 1960 and 1975, and then a pretty steady for high school and a pretty slow drop for elementary schools. So that's the reality. So it's now less than 9%. So that's still almost 5 million children between elementary and secondary are still in private schools. But it has gone down. Now that doesn't, but the later question is, well, who goes? Have there been changes in who goes? Have there been changes in what kind of private schools do they go to? Things we'd like to know. So another question is, how would increase in family income inequality affect private school enrollments? Well, the more Sean Reardon, who's my co-author on this work, Sean is a sociologist at Stanford, thought about this, the answer isn't really obvious. Something to do with taxes. Any suggestions why the answer? Why might you want to move to a high-quality suburb rather than send a child to private school? Well, even if the key is the mortgage on your housing, if you buy housing is interest on the mortgage is tax deductible, while private school tuition is not tax deductible. It can be substantial. So the answer wasn't obvious what would happen for that reason. But when you think about, when we thought about, well, what groups might be particularly affected by income inequality? Well, families that choose to live in cities, for one reason or another, they might be affected. Their schooling choices might particularly be affected by growing income inequality. And also families living in the South and to a lesser extent the West. The reason is that in this area, in Massachusetts where I live, school districts are very small. There are probably 50 school districts within 10 miles of Boston. In the South, school districts are contiguous with counties that are very, very large. So it's much more difficult to move to a community that only serves high-income kids, even if you have money to sell. So we thought we might expect a different pattern in cities and in suburbs. We might expect a different pattern in the South and the West than we do in the Northeast and the Midwest. Now, how do you study private schools? Well, it seems like if you're going to do this, you need to have data. And it turns out there's no perfect data set in the United States for example. What you'd really like to have, you'd like to get a data set for every child in the United States. You'd like to know where they went to school. You'd like to know their family income. You'd like to know if they went to private school, just what kind of private school, what tuition to charge. You'd like to know a whole bunch of things. There's no data set that does that. So what you have to do is put together a whole bunch of data sets and try and learn from those. Well, that's what we did. If you count up, there's an awful lot of them. And basically, this current population survey, the data set that the survey that's asked of American households every year, it's now up to about 100,000 households, does ask about schooling. Each month, in addition to the core questions we're asked about are parents employed, for which the employment data comes, there's also a supplement on some topic. Every October, the supplement is about education. So they ask in the October supplement, do you have kids in school? Do they go to a public school or a private school? Then in a few years, unfortunately, relatively rarely, there are 6 years in which they not only ask that, but they ask what kind of private school. Unfortunately, in 4 of those 6 years, they ask whether it's a church-related school or not, without distinguishing between Catholic schools and other private schools, and we'll see that makes a difference. So there's the decennial census that runs up through the year 2000. They ask basically the same questions. Big advantage is it's a vastly larger sample. There are these national household education surveys. They provide information on kinds of schools. They're much, much smaller. There are these longitudinal data sets that the Department of Education supports. And then there are the so-called private school surveys starting in 1989. The U.S. Department of Education does a census of all private schools. Unfortunately, you don't know anyone who goes to those schools except the racial composition. You don't know about the income. So we try to bring all of these together and see, well, what can we learn about trends in who goes to different kinds of private schools? Now, how do we do it? Well, it turns out it's I'm going to have just 2 slides. These are slide descriptions of methodology, pretty straightforward. So for example, from this current population survey in 1987, so they asked all the families, into what bin does your family income go? Is it below $5,000, $5,000 to $10,000? And the number of bins changes from year to year. Sometimes it's 12, now it's about 16. Okay. So if you take all the families that are, for example, in the less than $5,000 bin, then you can say, okay, these are all families that have children of elementary school age. And you can say, well, what percentage of the kids who are in elementary school or whose families are in that bin went to private school? And you get a number. It could be a pretty small number for that. Then you do the same for all the families that income in each one of these bins. And you basically get a number. You get a point estimate on what percentage of those kids who are of elementary school age, whose families are in that bin, went to private schools. And what you see is this. So at each one of these vertical lines, it represents an income bin. And you get a point estimate right in the middle of that tells you this looks like your estimate it's about 2% of kids in the lowest income bin went to private elementary schools. The bar around the midpoint tells you how precise the estimate is. And you see your precision of your estimates gets very low when you're on the far right at the high end. So basically you've got 16 data points. And basically what you do is you simply fit the curve through those data points using what's called Logit analysis. But it's straightforward. And you just fit this curve. And from that curve, you can then estimate for any income percentile what percentage of kids went to the private school. So basically, it's the same curve you saw here. Same curve. What you do is you say, oh, here's the 10th percentile. The height of this is 0.0263. So that's your estimate of 2.6% of those kids went to private school. How about for kids whose family income was the median? Well, that was 0.0989. So about 10% of them went to private schools. And how about for kids whose families were at the 90th percentile, and that your estimate was 17.4%. Okay. Now notice that from the 1987 current population survey, you've now got 3 data points. One for the 10th, one for the 50th, and one for the 50th. So let's take those 3 data points. We can do that for each year. And what we get is the three arrows are telling you about the 3 data points that you got from there, but you're going to do it for every year. You get a lot of data points about and the top one is telling you about the percentage from the 90th income families that went to private school. Next one is the median income families, and the bottom one is the 10th percentile income families. Then you can adjust using regression techniques to fit the best fitting curves. So that's really a quite straightforward, in principle, way of doing this estimation. Getting the data ready took 2 years to do. Now, so this is the same picture one more time. So this is estimate of the trend for children of elementary school age whose families are in the 10th percentile. What's the trend between 1968 and 2013 in the percentage of kids who went to private school? This is the same for the median income families, kids of median income. That's the 90th percentile. Now, if we had done the 95th percentile, it'd be way, way, way higher. But for reasons that you see here, going back here, notice once you get to the far right, the estimates become the standard average. So you don't have much confidence as you get far out here. So we got to 90th percentile because we have more confidence. So another 1 minute. What do you see? Please talk to a neighbor. What do you see?
The lower classes is pretty much the same at like 5%, which is really low. And then the 50th percentile, which would probably be like lower middle class, has how it's like slight steady decrease. Or the 90th percentile is kind of income families, how they experience a dip and they're kind of more like still like moving up in the
Spoken before. What do you see? Nice and loud, please.
The biggest difference with the median income, the 50th percentile income, is a pretty drastic difference now compared to the other.
Very nice. So it's changed how? What's happened to the median, to the percentage of kids from median income families who go to private schools?
There's less percent.
It's declined quite dramatically. So the 90-50 gap is the percentage of 90th percentile kids in private schools minus the percentage of 50th income kids in private school has grown substantially. But that's almost all because of the big decline in the 50s. Now, when you look at this, does it raise any questions for you? What else would you like to know? So spend 40 seconds, talk to the neighbor about what questions does this raise for you? What else do you want to know, having seen that? 40 seconds, please. Because I may not be able to answer what you want to know. But nonetheless, let's see. A couple of questions. Yes, sir. Yes, you, that's allowed?
Yeah, so I noticed that between 1970 and 1980, and also between 2000 to 2010, that's when you see a substantial portion of decline. Is that connected to like an economic downturn?
It's a terrific question. And it turns out, and you see it more clearly on subsequent graphs, the downturn for the high income, because we just, fitting smooth line through points, is pretty totally driven by the decline in the private school going rate of high-income parents in the 3 years after the onset of the Great Recession. You can see, notice those couple of points down low, right up there. I'm not tall enough for blue ones. So that's for that. So that's a key question. What role does economic, and the evidence seems to be for high-income families, particularly for relatively high-income African-American families, there was a big decline in private school enrollment rate in this year just after the onset of the Great Recession. Why African-American families in particular? There's a nice paper from a group in Harvard Institute showing those families took a much bigger financial hit than did high-income families that were white non-Hispanic. Now, what else might like to? Yeah, please.
I'm curious about whether the cost of private school tuition has changed, and also whether the number of private schools has changed, so that the availability has changed.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to actually get to those. That's good. I like questions that might be able to answer. How about one more? Yes, please. Yeah.
Do magnet schools count as private schools?
No, magnet schools are not private schools, and neither are charter schools. Yes, sir.
Could the trade-off between the preference for public versus private have changed? Maybe public schools increased in quality, making that more attractive?
That's exactly right. You do. There's a nice paper from Urban at the Brook Institution that shows just that. If you look at the gap in scores with the National Center for Educational Progress between kids in private schools and kids in public schools, that gap has gotten smaller. So that's a piece of it. But what I hope someone's going to ask is, private schools are not a homogeneous thing, right? It's all kinds of different private schools. So maybe this has something to do with what's happened to the mix of private schools. And an awful lot has happened there. So look at what's happened to the mix of private schools. And this speaks to the question of number. This is the proportion of students on the vertical axis who are in private schools. So the 3 lines vertically add up to 1 in any year. So basically, we see just enormous decline in the percentage of kids. So in 1960, back a little further, 9 out of 10 kids who were in private schools were in Catholic schools. Notice now it's only a little above 40%. Look at the other religions. That means a school with a religious affiliation, but not Catholic. That has grown substantially, from about 8% up to almost 40%. And then we look at the non-sectarian schools. That's grown from 0.6 up to about 0.2. So enormous change in the mix of private schools. So we might go and ask this same question. Remember we did before. We looked at this. So what would happen if we looked at the same kind of graph? Looked at it for each kind of private school, and this is what you see. So again, you see quite different patterns. Basically, on the left, see, and what we saw just before, this growth in non-sectarian schools, percentage of kids. Well, who's going to these non-sectarian schools? This is 90 percentile income families, 50% income families, 10%. So great growth in the affluent, kids from affluent families choosing non-sectarian private schools. Look at the Catholic schools. decline for everybody, because there's many, many fewer of those schools. But where is the decline the less sharp for the relatively affluent? When we talked about this work to the research director of the National Catholic Education Association, she said, this confirms our worst fears, that as the Catholic schools are increasingly serving kids from the upper part of the income distribution. Now, here's the puzzle. These are non-Catholic religious schools. Now, these are an enormously diverse group. These are Jewish day schools. These are Episcopal schools. About 38%, or more than a third, are conservative Christian schools, located primarily in the South and the West. Very diverse. So we see a decline in percentage of high-income families sending their kids to these schools, but a growth in the percentage of middle and low-income families. So while gaps by income have grown in these kind of schools, they've fallen over here. And the question is, why? And that's what we're going to turn to next. So big changes in, so if somebody asks anything about private schools, all you want to say, what kind of private schools are we talking about? Unfortunately, you'd like them more fine-grained, but you can't match it to family income getting any more fine-grained. So notice here, these are, again, it's so dependent on data sources. No data prior to 1987 for the Catholics and the other privates that's connected to family income. The early 1970 census does ask whether they're religious or not religious. You get a data point for them not religious. Now, we might also ask, what about urban families versus suburban? And basically that's the story. So basically, now this is in response to the question of your questions. Notice those 3 data points up, the blue data points up there. Those are the 3 years right after the recession. Those are the big decline in those years on the percentage of high-income urban families sending kids to private schools. But notice it goes right back up again once the kind of recession and recovery happens. So basically what you see here is that you've got an extraordinary decline in middle-income families. The same thing you pointed out before nationally, but here when it's even, the decline is even greater if you look among urban kids. That's to a very large extent a story about decline in Catholic schools. So again, the action here is, so basically a quarter of relatively high-income families. Now, the 90th percentile income family, it's $175,000. These are not hedge fund families. These are, if you teach in Boston, where teachers get paid over $90,000 a year, this is 2 teachers. And a quarter of them, of 90% income families, are sending their kids to private elementary schools. If you look at more affluent families, of course, it'd be much higher. So now, why is that? Why so much higher in among urban families than among suburban families? Well, it's got to do, to a significant extent, with what they think about the quality of their local public schools. So these are these are estimates from, these are surveys of parents from the Philadelphia Kaplan survey. Basically what you see is among suburban parents, the red line, the higher up the are in the income distribution, the better they think their local public schools are. So basically the affluent families are moving to the communities that have very high quality public schools, and they're paying very high prices to do that. So the better off a family is, the happier it is with this local public school. But look at urban families. Of course, urban families think less of their public schools in any year than do the suburban families. So notice here, the higher the income of urban families, does not mean that they think better of their private schools. You can't distinguish that from being a horizontal line. It's not different from zero in terms of slope. But basically, urban high-income parents don't think much of their urban public schools. And this is why they, of course, make this decision either to move to suburbs or to use private schools. So kind of, and last picture. I'm gonna, these are 4 regions of the country. Now, if you notice how different this focus on the South versus the Northeast. Midwest looks pretty much like the Northeast, and the West looks pretty much like the South. But let's look at South versus Northeast. So notice the big decline in the median income families in the Northeast going to the private schools. That's the Catholic school phenomenon. Catholic schools are overwhelmingly located in the Northeast. That's their big deal. Among, in the South, very few Catholic schools in the South, well, other kinds of schools. So not much of a decline. But notice this big growth. So there are now the percentage of high-income, kids from high-income families that are attending private elementary schools is higher in the South now than it is in any other region. And that's really an enormous change from what was the case several decades ago. So just to kind of, then we're going to talk about why did this occur. So again, it's kind of patterns. 90-50 gaps have grown, and that's primarily because of this big decline in median income families going to private schools. Catholic elementary school rates have shown long-term decline. In fact, if you go back to the earlier figure, there are now more kids from the bottom half income distribution in non-Catholic religious schools than there are in Catholic schools. I said that earlier. Big increases in non-tertiary elementary schools among high-income families, and private schools are much higher among rates in cities and in suburbs, and they grow more in the South and the West than. Now, why is this? Well, there's several. First of all, a big piece of it is families moving to the suburbs. This is the Catholic schools, which serve so many kids from throughout the income distribution in cities. Their historic clientele has to a very large extent moved into the suburbs. Increasing private school tuition. Look at what happened to private school tuition. This is net of inflation. Net of inflation. They've increased by more than 5-fold. Enormous. Now, why did they increase? Well, those who've done some economics know the so-called Baumol story, basically that in industries, in occupations that don't have high productivity gains, such as service like education, their costs are always going to continue to go up because you have to pay people enough to keep them working. But the other key piece of it is the decline in the number of religious vocations. In 1970, almost half of the faculty in private elementary schools were either nuns or priests. It's now 2.7%. So just enormous decline. So these tuition in these other schools increased as well. Now the puzzle is, really, since tuition increased in these non-Catholic religious schools by a fair amount, that was the one area where you saw the decline in the percentage of high-income kids going to those schools in the South, particularly, but the increase in the middle and lower income. Well, I think to a very large extent, this is a story about religious affiliation. And there's a large percentage of families in the South, and to a lesser extent in the West, who are conservative Christians, where the number of Supreme Court decisions saying no prayer in the schools, many of those families didn't think public schools were their schools anymore. So they increasingly sent their kids to these Christian, conservative Christian private schools. So just about half of the kids in the South who are in private elementary schools are in conservative Christian schools. and they're overwhelmingly from median income and low income families. The high income families in the South send their kids to private schools, but they're overwhelmingly these non-sectarian private schools. So that's really the story there, and that's pretty much the story that I have to tell you. So basically, both public schools and private schools have less socioeconomic diversity today than they had several decades ago. Particularly true in cities, particularly true in the South. It's much more difficult for schools segregated by income to succeed in filling these goals for American education with which I started to talk. I think this is a trend we as a nation should really be concerned about if we care about equality of opportunity and promoting this widely held value of intergenerational mobility. Thank you. I should take questions can you tell me when the questions are over, Steve? I enjoy the questions, the answers are most fun, so, President would like to ask. Yes.
Could you say something about the quality of these different schools? Should I be concerned about the changes in trends?
That's a good question. So the question is about quality. The interesting thing is, we don't know. We know a good deal about the quality of Catholic schools because they have been included in these surveys back for many decades. And Catholic high schools have done a particularly good job. Like how often Sean Reardon finds Catholic elementary schools don't do quite as good a job as conventional public schools in the area, but it's not huge differences. Perhaps the most troubling thing, and this is dated, is if in the 2003 National Assessment of Education and Progress, often called the Nations Report Card, that provides information on the reading and math scores of 4th, 8th, and 12th graders. In that survey, the scores from 4th graders attending conservative Christian schools were a half a standard deviation lower than they were in public schools. So these are schools that don't charge, they charge much more than they used to, but they don't have very well educated teachers. So they're struggling, and that's showing up with relatively low test scores. Now that's 2003, it's conceivable they're different now, 14 years later, but we don't have any evidence on that to my knowledge. What we don't know, how have these trends affected quality? What we don't know is, was it the weakest Catholic schools that went out of business, or was it not? So we don't know which schools went out of business, we only know at one point in time. Terrific question. Yes, sir.
So the regional slides you showed show the South, the upper income group was moving increasingly to private schools. The South and the West. In the South, one might think that might be racial segregation, maybe in addition to income segregation. Can you speak to what's driving it? Given some of the political dynamics and
it might very well be, and if one are interested in it, the one thing you can look at, you can't look at family income with the so-called private school universe survey, but they do tell you about the racial composition of the students in the school. So you could look at that, and these are data that are public, they're very easily accessible, they're very easy to use. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question, an important question.
Do you have any reasons for why the children above 13 years old did worse when they were moved out of their poor environments?
That's, the authors of that paper, I think, have been asked that a lot. It's only conjecture. I don't think anybody really knows. But I think, you've grown up in a very low-income public housing neighborhood. You get to be 13, adolescence has struck in, you don't have nice clothes, you've got not very good clothes. When identity is so important, you go to 9th grade and you feel very, very uncomfortable. In fact, what's happened to a lot of those kids is where do they spend their weekends? They go back to the neighborhoods that they came from. That's been documented, and that doesn't serve them well. So that's conjecture. The evidence is quite clear. Of course, 13 is a particular cutoff. They made two groups, but basically younger was better. But it's a very disturbing pattern.
I want to thank everyone for coming today. We also have a reception. When you leave I want to mention one other thing. For Jorge Aguilar's class, he has some yellow sheets out there where you can sign your name, and it's just on your way out the door. Otherwise, we have a reception. If you go out the door, it's going to be on the left if you'd like to stay and have some refreshments. Thank you for coming.